I'd like to welcome our next panel. It's called Promote and Advocate Diversity, Gender Equity in Pay and on Boards. And we are thrilled to have these esteemed business leaders join us on stage for this discussion. Our first panelist is Pamela Jeffrey. As the National Lead of Inclusion and Diversity Strategy Practice for KPMG, she brings over 25 years of success in delivering results for her clients across a variety of sectors. Pamela is an international thought leader and subject matter expert on the topic of inclusion and diversity, bringing a unique understanding of the challenges and opportunities women, minority groups, and their organizations face today. She's also a dear friend who founded the Women's Executive Network and has impacted thousands and thousands of women around the world. So, Pamela, thank you so much. Jan Kroot is the CEO of Pacific Blue Cross, who brings more than 30 years of strategic and transformational business expertise. His multi-industry experience includes public and private sector roles in financial services, insurance, healthcare, professional services, utilities, and manufacturing in Canada, United States, and Europe.
Pardon me?
Jan volunteers as a member of the Greater Vancouver Board of Trade's Women's Leadership Circle Advisory Committee. We're thrilled to have him on the WLC. Thank you, Jan. Corey Wilson is the current Executive Director of Indigenous Initiatives and Partnerships for BCIT. With over 20 years of experience in post-secondary education, community development, and the legal profession, Corey's passion lies in ensuring success for Aboriginal learners and other multi-barriered learners. She has a deep commitment to education and has dedicated her working life to ensuring that underrepresented learners succeed both within learning institutions and the larger community. Now, serving as moderator, thank you for Corey, is Laurie Matheson. So Laurie, please come up. She's president and CEO of the Chartered Professionals Accountants of BC. She was recognized by her peers with a CPA fellowship designation in 2016 and is one of Canada's leading lawyers in the area of tax law by the Best Lawyers in Canada publication in 2017. Laurie is involved with the community and currently serves as the Senior Vice Chair of the Greater Vancouver Board of Trade and serves on the board of Vancouver Public Library Foundation. Please join me in welcoming this panel to the stage.
Well, thanks very much. We have two very big issues to cover this morning, and we are so fortunate to have a panel of experienced, esteemed people that have really practical, on-the-ground experience with the issues that we need to talk about. So again, the format that we're going to follow will be similar to what you saw just in the previous panel. So we're going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to turn things over to the tables to have a discussion. We'll regroup after about 10 minutes to share the experiences from the table. I'll reach out to our panelists who will rove in the audience, and also, similar to last time, hopefully we have some audience members that stand up as well. So we will have our own discussion here for about 30 minutes. Let me just set the stage. We have two very big issues to talk about here: gender equality in pay and gender equality on boards. And we all know that both of these issues get a lot of discussion and media attention, but how are we really doing? Stats Canada data tells us that in terms of wage disparity, women get, on average, on an hourly basis, 87.9% of what men earn. If you restrict the sample size to those between the ages of 25 and 54, they're getting about 86%. And if you look at BC in particular, alarmingly, it's only 83% in BC. And we see something very similar in terms of boards. We have about 14.5% of board positions being owned by women. That's amongst the companies that are reporting. And for companies that are on the S&P or the TSX 60 list, it's about 26%, so way below where it should be. So we have two very interconnected issues, and we need to tie them together in the amount of time we have. So I think you can distill down to the fact that we have gender inequality in the workplace and also on the boardroom. So we need to do what we can to really promote and advocate change. So I'm going to turn it to the panel now, and I'm going to start with Pamela, who's renowned in the area, and I just saw in the Canada 150 book that she is listed as one of the champions around these issues. So we're so fortunate to have your perspective here. What can you share with us in terms of trends that you've been seeing in both areas over the past while?
Sure. So why don't we start off with looking at the pay gap? And you're quite right, we're at 87 cents. Now, the good news is that when I started university, which, by the way, was a few years ago. The pay gap was actually 77 cents. So the good news is we've been working to close the gap. And the other good news is that education counts. And so a woman who doesn't have high school will make about 74 cents of the dollar, whereas a woman who has a graduate degree will be at 90 cents. So there's still a pay gap, but that gap closes as your education increases. And that's what we have the power to do. We as women have the power to educate ourselves to close that gap. The other thing that I think is really important to note is that there's a trend towards more women obtaining university degrees. And so in 1991, women held, 14% of women had university degrees. Now, 36%. We actually have changed that much since 1991 with respect to holding degrees, that there are more women who hold degrees than men right now. And as a mother of 2 sons, that troubles me a little. Whereas men, 17% of men had degrees in 1991, and now they've been eclipsed by women because men hold 30% of men have degrees now versus about 36% for women. So you see, we've eclipsed men in terms of our education. So we're seeing the trend of more educated women. We're seeing the gap closing. And with respect to boards, you're quite right. We're not where we would like to be. According to the Canadian Securities Administrators, we're at 14%, up from 11% just 2 years ago in their first report. The good news is that there's not a single sector in this country now where women occupy fewer than 10% of the board seats. So we crossed that point in 2016. So that 14% figure is pretty disappointing. It improves with the size of market capitalization. So a large cap company, we're sitting at about 25% of those board seats held by women. It's the smaller cap companies where you're not seeing the representation, especially in the oil and gas industry. So that's really where we need to focus because of the number of board seats that they've got. So we're closing the gap slowly. And I'd just like to say one last point on that, which is that Stats Canada has done an amazing job of gathering this data. And if you look at within an occupation, there is a gap. It's just under $3 an hour. And if you cut through all the numbers and all the analysis, it's just under $3. So a man and a woman in the same occupation, that's the gap in terms of the hourly wage. If we can close that, and you have the power to close it, if we can close that, we'll see that 87 move to 97. So that's really where I believe we need to focus.
Something we all want to see, that move to 97. Well, thank you for that. And the numbers really do tell a story. I'm going to try to move our conversation now beyond the current state, more towards what Pamela was already doing, talking about how education can be a way forward, and just other things we can do to promote and move our way forward in both areas in terms of pay and also the board representation. Now, Jan, Pacific Blue Cross, that's the organization, of course, that you lead, it's known for having a very diverse leadership team. What have you done to accomplish that?
And it isn't just a diverse leadership team, it in fact is a diverse workforce that we have across our entire company. A couple of years ago, I asked some questions of our leadership team, and particularly of our human resources people, who you typically turn to for that kind of information, asking, how diverse are we? What does our workforce look like? And we didn't have any answers. And something that I would encourage every organization to do is go through a self-examination and actually get the data on what you look like as a company or as an organization. So the difference between 2 years ago and today is that if you ask any of our employees, any one of them, because of what we've done in terms of understanding the nature of our workforce, is if you say, what proportion of the workforce are women? They'll tell you, 65%. What proportion of women are there in senior management? 65%. What proportion are there at the senior executive team? 50%. How many nationalities do we have in the company? 35. How many different languages spoken? 19. Do we have diversity on the executive team? Yes, everything from sexual preference to gender to ethnicity. So they understand the answers to those questions because we went through a process of self-examination. That's also helped us to ask the questions, once we have the data, is, are we fair in our compensation practices? Are there gaps in our compensation practices? You won't know it unless you know what your workforce looks like. And I would encourage anyone who's applying for a role in an organization, whether it's on the front line, middle, or top, to actually ask the leader of the organization,
That's right.
not only what's your policy, but what does your organization look like? And if they can't give you a picture, then you know something is wrong.
You're so right. It's about measurement. Just nailed it.
So that's how we got there, and because of the nature of our workforce, we like to think of ourselves as basically not just gender blind, but blind to any element of diversity that exists in our workforce. It's not an impediment to advancement. It is all about skills. And I forgot to mention, we also asked how many, because we had no idea, how many First Nations employees do we have? We thought we had none. We have 9. 9. And I was thrilled. One of them is in the senior management team. We had no idea at all, because unless people self-identify, then you don't know. So measure, and then you've got the basis for actually changing your organization.
The numbers don't lie.
No.
Data. So, Corey, I'm going to turn to you, and in the educational institutional space, what types of efforts are you seeing being made by the various institutions really to promote and advocate diversity?
Well, certainly in post-secondary institutions, there's a lot of initiatives that are happening. They're happening on different levels. One thing that we have to think about as students, from a student perspective, in terms of courses, it's probably where we've seen the greatest change so far in terms of inclusion in the curriculum. I remember when I was in law school, I think it was called it was Canadian Legal Institutions. Discussion of Indigenous people was like chapter 32 in the book, and we of course only had time to get to chapter 28. So now we're seeing, that was a long time ago when I was in law school, but now we're seeing the inclusion of different perspectives in the curriculum, and you really can't move ahead without having those perspectives in there. So great change in terms of inclusion in curriculum, and then students can see themselves reflected, which is fantastic. Where I think the biggest challenge is, and there are moves, certainly universities have used the getting a human rights exemption to hire a specific person, whether that's a person of color, whether that's an Indigenous person, or whether that's a person who represents the LGBT community. You can get a human rights exemptions, and we're seeing more people into the academy in that regard. In terms of pay equity, I think it's very strict in the sense of wages are determined by a body outside of all post-secondary institutions. However, the difference comes in where you actually start. You may be at the same level, but you have to advocate for where you start on that scale. But we are seeing changes, and more, whether it's women, whether it's Indigenous people, whether it's other marginalized people getting represented in the academy. But it's whether they get tenure and what counts for tenure. So we still haven't sorted all of those things out. Does my community involvement as an Indigenous person, how does that relate to, is that equal to 1 publication in a prestigious journal, or does that relate to 2 publications? So those are the types of big challenges that are happening. We are seeing changes at the university as well as the college and institute level, where there are specific protocols and targets and calls to action, if you will, that universities and colleges are signing on to. So those are positive changes, but again, the challenge comes to finding those people We have more Indigenous people, the latest statistics, more Indigenous people women going to university than any other groups, the fastest rise out of all people in the country. So that's, yay, yes, very brilliant. But it's then about how do we mentor them into those positions. So remember, it was illegal for Indigenous people to get a post-secondary degree until 1951, so we're still a little bit behind the 8 ball. But there are changes and there are motivations, but it's still ivory tower in some cases, and there's still a fight to be had. But it's slowly changing. I don't think it's changing fast enough, but I think as society changes and the nature of our students and when these young ladies that are here go to university, they're going to demand something different. And the reality is our universities and colleges exist based on the number of students that we have. So if we don't please the students and don't attract them to our institutions, then they're not going to come. And that's really, I think, the lens. And maybe it's a purely financial desire on some institutions' part, but at least it's leading to change. And so we are seeing a push and a change and an improvement that way.
Do you find it's an active conversation, or is it a conversation you need to push to make
it depends. I mean, I think as academics, we have a tendency to think we have all the answers, and I know about this, we don't need to talk about it. But yet, so you do have to push in many cases, and you do have to talk about the elephant in the room. We're going to get to advice afterwards, but academics are often their own worst enemies, right? Because I've done all the research, and the research says, but often, again, that ivory tower, you're not on the ground in the practical, in the real world. So there is a need to bridge that divide and that disconnect.
Thanks. So let's think more about next steps. Pamela, I'm going to put things back to you. Mm-hmm. What needs to be done next in terms of action, and how can others really champion pay equity and equality in the boardroom?
It starts with the young women in this room. And my challenge to you is when you negotiate your first job salary, and you just heard that word, negotiate. So the research shows that a young man is much more likely to negotiate that salary than is a young woman. And that holds true throughout your career. Men, you guys are much better negotiators than we are. So it starts with when you're coming.
Not genetic.
It's not genetic.
No, they've been taught.
It's the way we're taught.
Yeah, you're taught that, and it's just not. It's not traditionally a trait that we have been celebrated for, and that's another issue, which is as you move into the workforce, into new roles in organizations, you'll find that there is a definition of what leadership looks like. It's a very historic definition of what leadership looks like. And leadership looks more like Jan than it does like me. And so what you can do as women moving through your careers is redefine what leadership looks like. And you can do that by negotiating. You can do that by finding a very good mentor, or in my case, I had a wonderful group of mentors, both men and women. As Philip Grosch was talking about at PwC, it's also having a sponsor. That's very, very important, to have somebody who's going to sponsor you, have the belief that you have the abilities, and having a network is very important as well. Women traditionally have not had access to the same kind of informal networks guys have had. And last but not least is our organizations were structured at a time when Dad went to the office and Mom stayed at home. And you're very lucky now for the young women in the room with organizations like KPMG and others that are leading the way with respect to providing more flexible workplaces. And to that point, last year at our firm, 41% of our promotes to partner last year were women. 41%. Right. So it can be done. So that's what I would say is a challenge to the audience is you have an important role to play. A lot of women have worked very hard to get to this point, and now it's over to you. And we'll be here helping and supporting you.
Thanks, Pamela. Jan, I'm going to come down the line and go to you next. What can be done next? You heard over to you, to the audience, in terms of what the women themselves can do and what the organizations can do to support. What's your perspective?
I have 3 daughters, and I have trained them up in a way perhaps that daughters typically don't get trained, in the same way as my son.
Okay.
And
Great.
what I've told them from an early age is the only person that manages your career is you.
Yes, good advice.
The only person that manages your compensation is you. The only person that manages your educational aspirations is you.
Yeah.
To go with that, I mean, a lot of people are very uncomfortable about conversations around career development, but particularly around compensation. And there's no reason to be uncomfortable with it.
That's right.
But it does take getting over a hurdle the first time, and it's always the first time. So I'm happy to say that my own daughters have moved beyond that embarrassment, and they're now negotiating, and they're successful. They all have advanced degrees, and
congratulations, Dad.
And they've moved on, and are doing well. But it also goes back. I'd like to talk a little bit about first principles, and talk about my experience, which isn't a Canadian one. Because sometimes we're often looking for a silver bullet. We're looking for an easy solution. And some of what we need to be driving at starts with children when they're young and their involvement in the community. So let's go to Norway for a minute, and only for a minute. I'm Norwegian born. I was raised there in my early years. I have a deep, deep connection with the country. I speak Norwegian, which is one of the most useless languages on the planet to speak, because everybody in Norway speaks flawless English. In Norway, it's renowned for having 50% or more of women in leadership positions, in corporate positions, on boards, in politics, all the way through. But they didn't do that because they decided one day we need a silver bullet and we're going to mandate it. It's part of the culture. It's part of how people are raised in Norway. And the way it's done is from an early age, you get involved in community organizations. Everybody does. Girls and boys, young men, young women, adult men. The average involvement in Norway in community organizations per person is the highest in the world at 3.4 organizations, voluntary organizations that citizens are involved in. And when you build that kind of capacity into your society from a very early age, it means that there are no distinctions between male and female when it comes to leadership, who assumes control power, who moves into business, into leadership roles, and into political roles, because everyone is blind to it, because they've come up through a society that values community involvement, political involvement, business involvement, without distinction for male and female. So it starts at a very early stage. So I always caution against looking for easy solutions or a silver bullet. We really do need to start with our own children and encourage them, because that will lead both to a comfort with leadership and asking the tough questions around career and compensation, but also involvement.
And, you know, Jan, to your point, for the folks in the room, isn't it important that they get involved in the community organizations? And I always encourage you to put your hand up and express interest in joining the board, and to build your board career as you're building your career in management.
Absolutely.
So you have the opportunity to give back to the community, learn some leadership skills, bring learnings back to your own organization, and develop yourself, develop your skills, and develop your comfort level being a leader.
And I'm very happy, just referencing universities, that almost all of the universities I've seen these days in their applications want to know about your community involvement. Now, I think that's a little too late, and we should be pushing it even further down. But it's good that that is now becoming a criteria, because it does then allow universities to develop leaders without distinction.
That's right.
I love the example about the cultural change and how it really has been so effective in Norway, and hopefully we get to that space here. Corey, I'm going to pass things to you. What is the one thing that we could do to change?
I think in terms of one thing to do, I think it's absolutely vital that each of us recognize our own privilege I don't think we do enough discussion about our privilege. The fact that all of us are in this room is privileged. Even though I'm Aboriginal and I'm a woman, I recognize that I have privilege over many other Indigenous women. So recognizing and being completely honest with the privilege that each of us in this room have and why we have that privilege and where it came from, as well as, and we've got our new friend from Boston coming up after lunch talking about unconscious bias. I think that's another discussion that must happen, whether it's amongst your friends, whether it's amongst your workplace, or wherever it is we really need to be aware of our unconscious bias and why we behave the way we behave and why we make the choices that we make. And the reality is lack of diversity or lack of representation of others shapes the world that you live in. So, you know, in some cases, if you're not happy with the world that you're living in, what are you doing to change it? If we don't have representation or inclusion of all people, then we're not really living our best selves or being our best selves, whether it's as an organization or as a company or as a community or as a nation. I come from a long line of potlatching people, and one thing that's significant about the potlatch is that everybody, and our culture generally, is that everybody has a role, everybody has value, and not one value is more than another. And we were just looking at my sister in the 150 book, and our granny used to always say, because I'm often asked, well, why are all the men chiefs in your community if women have power and women have a role? And as our granny always said, is that women are too busy doing other things to be the chief. And in fact, women choose who will be the chief. And a chief is always basically told what to do by the women in his family. So it's really just a figurehead. And you know, it's about going back to those values. A nation or a person or a family, if one member of the family is not doing well, then the entire family suffers. So how do you build that strength? And I think you have to be bold, you have to be authentic, and you have to be intentional in the actions that you do, whether that's taking the data, whether that's, you know, looking around the room. If everybody looks like you, well, you have a problem. And if you recognize that problem, you must do something about it. You know, I often get from people, well, I'm not really sure how to deal with Aboriginal issues or things like that. It's 2017. There's enough literature out there and enough people out there for you to seek that information and find out that information. So, thank you. So, yeah.
I love these cross-cultural learnings that are coming together. We have a bit of a theme here, but it really does resonate, and we can learn something from that and bring that forward. So we have just a few minutes left here. I'd like to ask our panel to leave us all with a call to action. And then after that, we will go out to the tables and have a table discussion, then return back. But call to action, Pamela, what would you like to leave the audience with?
I would like for each of you who are well along in your careers to identify a young person who you can sponsor, who you can get to know, you can see their abilities, and you can sponsor them. So my call to action would be sponsorship to those of you who are along in your careers, and to those of you who are beginning your careers, to really seek out a sponsor. A sponsor will make a huge difference in your career. And I've had several, and I couldn't have, enjoyed the career that I've had without sponsors, men and women who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. So really, really hugely successful in helping you develop your career. So sponsorship, sponsorship, sponsorship.
Thank you. Jan, call to action.
My call to action is ask the questions. Ask as many questions as you possibly can of the leadership in the organization. For any of you who are joining an organization or want to advance, ask the questions. Ask a leader what their whole approach to diversity is, what their approach to pay equity is. Ask the question whether they even know what their workforce looks like. And if a leader doesn't know what his or her workforce looks like, then you've got a problem the moment you come into the organization.
Yeah, very good point.
And so search out those organizations that are progressive, where you can make a difference because they know what their complexion is. And if you don't ask the questions, then it's on you. You're in danger of making wrong decisions about where you go and how your career advances. So be brazen, be bold, be willing to walk away, but get the right answers to your questions.
It's good advice.
Corey, call to action.
Mine would be mentor. So very much along the same lines is finding somebody to mentor and a couple of people to mentor, and particularly somebody that maybe doesn't have the same career goals as you.
Yeah.
Somebody that is different from you, somebody that's had an experience that's different than you. So mentoring is extremely vital. And also I would say it's about remembering that it's not about equality. We talk a lot about equality, but equality is treating everybody the same and fairly, and certainly we want pay equity and certainly we want diversity on boards, but really what it's about is equity. We need to give others the tools that if we have a toolbox, some of us have our toolbox is full with the right tools and the tools we need to become CEO of the company. But many people will also have a toolbox, but they may not have the right tools. So I think our job is to figure out how to give people those tools, how to ensure that they know how to use those tools, and that we support them along the way to becoming, because people have different challenges than when they come to the workplace or when they come to the classroom, and we need to ensure that there's equity there, and it's not just simply about equality and treating everybody fairly, but it's treating everybody fairly according to the toolbox that they have. Or don't have, I guess.
One more thought there.
Just one last thought. So I love what you just said around mentorship. And I'm often asked, well, what's the difference between a sponsor and a mentor? And so the difference for me has always been that a mentor will talk to you. A mentor will answer questions, give you guidance, will talk to you. And a sponsor will do that as well and will talk about you.
Yes.
A sponsor will talk about you and your skills to others. So I think that's an important distinction just to make.
Thanks. So we have sponsorship, mentorship, and ask the questions. What great calls to action from our panel here. Thank you for the insights. We're going to turn things over now to the business leaders in the audience. And there's a question that we're going to pose for the discussion. It'll pop up here in a minute. It's going to be, how do we promote and advocate gender equality in pay and on boards? So that's the question again. How do we promote and advocate gender equality in pay and on boards? You can input your answers at slido.com. And we're going to regroup in about 10 minutes to hear what you are talking about at your tables and bring it together. So in about 10 minutes. Thank you, Pam.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
So we're going to look out at the tables and get some answers to our question, how do we promote and advocate gender equality in pay and on boards? And Karina, I think you have someone over there.
I do. I have an awesome person who's wearing an awesome color, is she not? Here we go.
So I sat at two tables, and two things that I heard. One from this table here was that when we're looking for boards and people are applying for funding and organizations are applying for funding, is asking those questions, actually having it on the application. What is the diversity of your board? So asking the questions that Jan asked. What is the makeup of your board? What is the makeup of the organization as part of the application process? And there was discussion as to whether or not that would be considered or not, but definitely that's a place to start. And what I heard at this table over here, which seems to be a table of accountants, keep calm, I'm an accountant, it says. They have balls on their table over here, that's what the balls say, is that university doesn't teach you how to deal with no. Doesn't teach you, if you stand up and you go to your boss and say, I think I deserve a raise, and he or she says no, how do you deal with that and cope with that the next day? And there was a bit of a comment about perhaps men are taught to deal with that a bit better than women are, so I would say we got to start teaching our young ladies to know how to deal with that and know that it's okay to ask and be told no. We just keep asking and not internalize it, or what else, other stuff that can happen.
And one more comment here.
So there were two specific strategies that came up at our table 37. I'm Catherine Lazarek, the host of that table today. One of them was a call to action for senior leaders who are responsible for doing yearly salary reviews and increases. And the point was raised that if someone is on a maternity leave or paternity leave, they often don't show up in the system. So even though they may have worked for a significant portion of the year and deserve a bump in their salary, they're not on that list. So the call to senior leaders was, be aware of those people. If they don't show up on your list, put a reminder on your calendar for when they come back to do their salary review and make sure they get the bump they deserve right away when they come back, and address the systemic issue that keeps them invisible during their leave. And then the other thing for boards was institute term limits on boards, because the status quo, as Janet said, was like replaces like. So introducing a quota or introducing a term limit or both would be helpful for encouraging turnover on boards. Thanks, Karina.
Thank you. Great thoughts. Another table over here.
Hi. Just to continue that last comment about on boards, and really what we were talking about was being very deliberate. So when your term limit is up and you're looking for your next board member, really committing that our next board member is going to be, insert diversity here. It's going to be a woman, is going to be millennial, is going to be culturally diverse from our existing board members, but really as a board committing to that and having those uncomfortable conversations where you stand up and say, no, we really need to pay attention to this and we need to, as a group, commit to it.
Thank you. Well, really terrific thoughts from the panel and also from the room. We heard about sponsorship, mentorship, asking the hard questions, putting some responsibility on senior management to make sure that they are following through with gender issues. And of course, asking the hard questions, having the uncomfortable conversation at the board table to make sure that the board composition is where it needs to be. Thank you all for your contributions today, and look forward to seeing you after lunch.